All right. So I'm just going to give a quick overview on what Agile is and how it pertains specifically to UI developers. I'm going to make a couple videos about this, but this is going to be a super high level. So Agile methodology has a manifesto, and it's a manifesto because there's a bunch of opinions on how things should be done, and they basically said in the Agile manifesto, these are the principles that we're going to focus on, and there aren't hard and fast rules for anything, but there are principles that we try to align to. The first one is individuals and interactions over process and tools. This is the idea that everybody and the interactions between the people who are working are more important than the tools and the processes that we use to do that, including Agile. So if something inside of the process is getting in the way, change the process and not try to fit people into the process or the tools. Working software over comprehensive documentation. In the end of the day, working software is more important than the documentation. If you have documentation and your code doesn't work, that's useless, where if you have working code but no documentation, at least you have something to sell. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Instead of saying, no, you agreed to this, you're going to get what we say you're going to get, no one's going to buy that. So the customer is always right. And that's the thing, is that customers aren't always the paying customers. They're also anybody who consumes your software. So if you have another team using your UI because you wrote your UI to their API, you both are kind of each other's customers. You both negotiate in and out what needs to go, what needs to be written. And then you need to respond to change over following a plan. Anytime you create a plan and it's getting in the way or it's getting dogmatic, change to either a new plan or don't have a plan, just try to make things work. And Agile solves the lack of flexibility, lengthy development cycles, limited customer involvement, inefficient communication, and high risk of project failure that old methods of development like waterfall had, where you'd sit down and write a specification and then you'd hand that specification off to a bunch of business people. They'd all sign off and you would just be sitting there twiddling your thumbs until they signed off on it. And while you were building it, they couldn't do anything. They couldn't do customer outreach. The customers couldn't get involved to say that they actually don't want the thing that they originally talked about, but now you can't do anything about it because it's already in the works. And anytime that you do it like that, then you're basically forcing something when it shouldn't be forced. And if anything goes wrong, then the entire project is a failure. So here are some key pieces of terminology. An epic is a high-level bucket of stories. So it usually aligns to some feature or application that needs to be developed, like some search screen or some, a claim or some customer UI. Like it usually is just a high-level bucket of stories, right? Then you have a sprint. Out of 2 weeks of work, you have a bunch of stories that you're going to be working on, and we'll get to what a story is. And how much you pull into the sprint, how many pieces of work you pull into the sprint, is determined by the team velocity. The story is basically a chunk of work, and there are multiple stories that you'll pull into a single sprint. And this could be anything as easy as add a button to the screen to save, or as complicated as set up the deployment pipeline for production deployments and stuff. So it could, and that is all determined by complexity of story points, and we'll get there. But a story could be anything from dev work, so build this thing and validate this thing, but it could also be QA work, like specifically a story could just be like test this thing. A story could also have both dev work and QA work inside of it, and that's generally what we want to do, is have a single unit of work testable at the end of a sprint. So at the end of the sprint, you should say that it was built, tested, and deployable. But it is possible to have a story that is just QA work because the development work was too big. But it could also just be research. You could have a story that says, go and spend 5 hours and research how to do this thing. Those are called spikes. They're usually not pointed using story points, but generally you can have a story that just does that. So a story point is an arbitrary number that determines a story's complexity. It's just a 1 to 5 scale, or it could be a Fibonacci scale like what we use, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and 13. But generally it's just how hard is it to do this thing? Like that, but add a button example. It could be a 3-point story. I have to integrate with an endpoint. I have to add the button to the UI, and the testing is a little complicated. It could be a 13, like in that pipeline. It's like, this is going to take me so long to set up all the deployment options and stuff. Then your velocity inside of a sprint just is a rolling average of the story points that is being delivered by the team. So this helps the product owner and the team understand how much they can pull in. If you start to get bogged down by stuff, you can see that velocity, shrink. And this is dependent on how big the team is, how good the team is, all that stuff. But generally speaking, the velocity will help you indicate how much you can do in 2 weeks. Here are the roles inside the software development lifecycle in the Agile. You have the product owner who represents the customer, and they define the product requirements. Like, I need to see this button in this UI, and it needs to be able to do this. But it's super, super high level. The product owner shouldn't know really anything about coding. They should just say, I need to be able to do this. Scrum Master is somebody who goes in between each role, and they don't do the work of each role, but they should understand a little bit of what it takes to do each role so that they can communicate effectively between them. Because each one of these roles should be very focused on what they're doing. And if there's a problem like, I can't log into my machine and I can't get in contact with whoever, the Scrum Master should be the one person you reach out to say, hey, I need to be able to do this. Can you help me? And they'll reach out to whatever other team, IT services. They'll do a lot. And they're basically like the social lubricant in that scenario. Developers obviously write code to build it to the specification that's in the stories, and then QA are the people who test the code and validate that it's correct. So here are the different ceremonies, and a ceremony is a type of meeting that will happen regularly inside of Agile. You have your daily stand-up. You have your refinement that doesn't necessarily happen every day, but it happens multiple times a week. You have your sprint review, which happens every 2 weeks. Retrospective happens every 2 weeks. And sprint planning happens every 2 weeks. Your stand-up, again, happens every day. You'll report your progress and anything that went wrong when you were trying to build the thing you were writing, whether it's an API was down from another team, or you just couldn't figure out how to do it, that this is the place to get help. QA will validate changes, and they will report on any bugs that they found in the previous day. This is where a developer who doesn't have work will pick up any bug work that needs to be done. The Scrum Master, again, will facilitate between all the different roles and document action items. An action item is basically just like, this person needs to go research this thing, or this person needs to talk to this other person. Just, they help you not have to remember things. And then the product owner will provide direction for in-flight changes and accept stories. So once a story is tested, it needs to be accepted and validated by the product owner that it's ready to go and be merged in to the code base and be ultimately delivered, right? They'll also, if there's any issue with the way that you have to write something, like I couldn't make that button do what you wanted it to do, it's too complicated. Or you could even say there's a lot easier way to do it. This library just allows us to do it this way. You can negotiate in the change like that during the sprint. And usually you don't want to change a story as it's pulled in, after it's pulled into a sprint. But the idea of Agile is that everything's a living document. You should be able to change those things. So a product owner is there and available every day in stand-up for those sorts of in-flight questions. In refinement, this is where you're going to take a look of not ready stories. So these are not ready to work on yet, but you're trying to detail them out so that they are ready. So a developer will negotiate technical requirements and feasibility. If a product owner is like, I want when you click this button for it to rotate your monitor 360 degrees, you can't do that. It's not technically feasible. It's up to us as developers to say that we can't do that. For QA, this is that's feasible for testing and also what needs to be tested and how it's going to be tested. If somebody's asking, I need to be able to hit a button and have it, do all of these different testing scenarios. If you don't have the data to test it, if you don't have the mechanisms or the tools to test it, they need to be able to say, hey, we can't do that. But also they're helping determine the complexity along with the developers. The Scrum Master is there for documentation of action items. And again, the product owner is there as the person presenting the stories and also providing direction and making sure that the backlog is filled with new work. So the sprint review happens every 2 weeks. At the end of the sprint, once everything's signed off, and hopefully every story that was pulled into the current sprint was accepted and tested. And this is where you show off what you built to the stakeholders. And a stakeholder is just somebody who's part of the business who has a stake in what's being built. They have a vested interest, whether they are a product manager, whether they're another product owner, whether they are just a customer representative or account manager. They are there to see the software, and they probably had some impact in what was being built. So the developers in the QA will usually demo what is being delivered that sprint, because it's kind of a good idea to have a developer reiterate what what was asked for. And if a developer can demo what was asked for and the stakeholders like that, then we can guarantee that the customers are probably going to like that. Not guarantee, but it's a very good sign if the stakeholders who are representing the customer, if the PO who is representing the customer, if they all agree with what's being demoed by the developer, there's a shared understanding in what's being delivered. The product owner will be there to announce any changes and give a quick update on the project health and progress, essentially going through the roadmap and to announce what's coming next in the next 2 weeks. And then you have your retro. The retro is a place where all members can discuss any problems that might have come up during that last sprint and any efficiency gains that you can have, right? A new way to do things that you might want to show off to other people. There are different types of problems that can come up. Misrequirements are like, hey, I asked for this thing, but we didn't document it correctly, so you didn't build it in. Or a stakeholder might have noted inside the sprint review, hey, I actually asked you, product owner, to put this in, and it didn't get implemented. That's just, sometimes things get missed. A defect is if something was noted in the story, but it was written wrong or there was a bug and it just didn't do what was required of the code. There's also pointing discrepancies where if you said that something was way easier to build and it wasn't, like, oh, we pointed this as a 5, but it wasn't actually that complex. Or it's like, oh, we pointed this as a 3, but it should have been an 8. Like, this is way harder than I thought. And this is to finally drill down and make that velocity as accurate as possible so that you can plan your sprints better. Then team issues. This is more outside the realms of technical worlds. This is like somebody went on vacation and didn't properly, let the team know, or somebody wrote super messy code and you had to go in there and bug fix something and it was just super hard to read. It's like you need a place to kind of air grievances in a way that's healthy, and that is what the retro is for. And retro is also for giving kudos. Kudos is at the end of every 2 weeks. You pick people to say, hey, I like what you did here, right? It's just to build morale. After a retro, we'll do sprint planning. And this is where you get ready for the next 2 weeks of work. So the developer and the QA will help negotiate what goes in and out of the sprint. So everybody's involved in what is going to be worked on. And the developers and the QA are there to say, it would be a good idea if we did this first. I know we need to deliver this product owner, but it would be a lot easier if we worked on this first, right? Or the QA might say, oh, if we work on this stuff, then we'll have to test it all in one sprint, and that'll be hard to do, right? So we're always negotiating how we're going to be working on things, what the sequence of work best looks like. The Scrum Master is going to be there facilitating like they always do. They're also running the meeting. So they're going to be, documenting any action items. They're going to be, pulling the stories in with the tool that you're using, like whether it's Jira, Trello, or whatever. And then the product owner is going to be there to help prioritize what goes in the sprint. Like at a high level, they need to know I'm going to release this feature on this date, or that's what they're hoping to project, right? So they're going to be creating that sprint goal that says, at the end of this 2 weeks, I should have this feature, right? So after 2 weeks, you should be at that sprint goal, and then you basically roll back to the sprint review again. And then after the sprint review is done, then you retro, then you sprint plan. And then every day there's a stand-up where you talk about what you did that day, or the previous day, what you're going to work on, and you have story refinements that are kind of peppered in throughout the week. So that was kind of a general rundown on what Agile is at a high level, and in another video I'm going to go into what that actually means tangibly as a day-to-day operation. We'll go into Jira, we'll go into the code, and see what that looks like to work inside of Agile.